The Worldwide Conservatorium of Music welcomes you to Lives of the Great Composers. Today, J.S. Bach, presented by Dr. Robert Dean.
Hello. My friend Dr. Dean was going to be giving this little chat today, but alas, he has been sent on leave without pay. As you know, he does a lot of extracurricular musical activities, which often take him away from the university. Upon a recent return, he was told that, and I quote, "the students must come first," something he took in entirely the wrong way. Never mind. Johann Sebastian Bach was born of a musical family in 1865, and his output was prodigious. 22 children, some of whom survived. He also wrote a mountain of music, probably because it was the only time he could get away from the ankle biters. Bach was in his day a famous organist, and at the age of 18 he became organist at St. Boniface's Church in Arnstedt, where two youthful incidents most probably turned him into the parsimonious, prudent, and pedantic old codger he became. Firstly, he was disciplined for fighting, and his second rollicking came after he had taken a strange maiden into the choir loft. Her story was that she only wanted to experience his organ, but this was not accepted, and she was instructed to go back to practising on her own clavier. While at the same time it was suggested to Johann Sebastian that he might want to apply for Buxtehude's prestigious job in Lübeck. What put him off, however, was that the successor's job included the obligatory marriage to Buxtehude's 30-year-old daughter, which I think says more about the girl than she would want publicly known. He eventually picked up a job scribbling tunes for the Duke of Saxe-Weimar as court composer. Around this time, an aunt had left him a small inheritance, so he married his cousin, which seems appropriate. Later, when he attempted to leave the Duke's employ, for his insubordination he was thrown into jail. A shameful period in the history of the Musicians' Union. Finally freed, however, he joined Prince Leopold's court, but tragedy followed. After a quarter junket to the spa in Carlsbad, he came home, and immediately upon his return he was shown his wife's grave. She had been buried in his absence, presumably with reason. Now, what was he to do? He had 4 surviving children, so he shortly thereafter remarried and continued his quest to have more little Bachs. Finally, he became cantor of St. Thomas's Church and School in Leipzig, a prestigious and demanding job, and here is where his genius shows. Throughout his life he had always created huge amounts of music. Indeed, he had very little spare time for his only hobby, coitus. Now these strands came together. He forced his wife and children into hard labour. They became the sort of Xerox of their day, sharpening quills, drawing staff lines on paper, copying parts, while also running his instrument sales and rental business and performing as a vocal and instrumental ensemble. So, as you can see, though it has often been said that Bach was not an innovator, and in the world of music perhaps not, but in an industrial sense he preempted 3 of the greatest innovations that we still rely on today: the production line, the sweatshop, and nepotism. Bach's compositions were famous for their counterpoint. Counterpoint, for the uninitiated, is basically where you weave 2 melodies together to create a third, which is less interesting than the original 2. Bach defied fashion and logic to become the master of the form. Many still say that his music is mathematical and boring, but my friend, Dr. Dean, is a great fan and has performed Bach around the world. At concert's end, to get the audience back on side, he always finishes with the barcarolle. Very witty. I believe that if you take a serious look at his music, you reach the inescapable truth that, in spite of appearances, he loathed both musicians and children, and his malice was mainly directed towards his pupils. For once they had learned the basics, he forced them to play pieces of his own composition. Here we see the man's true nature. Even now, giving a child a piece of Bach to play is always accompanied by a feeling of malicious delight, as he is still without parallel as a discreet form of child abuse. Towards the end of his life, his eyesight became bad, and shortly before his death, a Dr. John Taylor operated unsuccessfully upon him. This led to the terrible joke of the time that his death had been tailor-made. Summing up, whatever one might say, it is certainly true that a talent like Bach doesn't grow on trees. But many of his children also made their mark. I particularly like C.P.E. Bach, J.C. Bach, and Often. I gather that was a side-splitter in 1872. I look forward to our next little discussions. Till then.
This week's featured books are The Key Change in Atonal Music, Fact or Fiction, and Embouchure for Pleasure and Profit. Available on Amazon, just upriver from the town of Abydos, where you will also find this week's featured CD, As Seen on Television, Russian Band Favorites, conducted by Boris Yeltsin. You can find all these and more at the Worldwide Conservatorium of Music website. Just remember what all our students say about us. What a con. That's whatacon.com. This program produced by Gregory Gish.